Cool. So the project is, I entitled it a rendition on a Nattiez narrative experiment because we will dive into my own composition and kind of go through the experiment that Nattiez did with The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas. Yeah, so Nattiez's own experiment examples slash the results of that experiment. So a lot of, we don't have to read this whole thing, but basically what Nattiez did was had these second year school children, so around ages of 11 to 14, they listened to The Sorcerer's Apprentice twice, and they were not given any information like the title or anything along those lines. And then they had about 20 or so minutes to make up a literal story based on what they heard. This is Michael, and this is David, two of my podcast buddies from our podcast, The Undergraduate, and they're helping me, make this project come to life. So again, thanks for doing this. Yeah, so this is, for example, this is a story that one of the school children came up with. So I'll read this this example, and then we'll look at some others. So this one says, in the street, someone is walking. Suddenly, the cavalry arrive. There's the sound of drums. There's a fight. The cavalry start off again quicker and quicker, and one can hear the sound of their hooves. Then everything stops. Rest. There is smoke on the other side of the hill. Battle. The blood flows on and on. There are many dead, except one. He recovers his calm, but suddenly something snaps. He kills himself. So, pretty dramatic, but that's what someone came up with through The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Here's another story. Night, in a toy shop. Everything is quiet. Suddenly, a toy wakes up. A tin soldier pays court to a doll, but a puppet arrives, and it's an unending struggle. The soldier and the doll go far away, but they are followed. They run more than ever and get rid of their attacker. At dawn, the shopkeeper returns and finds the objects in place. That one, to me, when I listen to Sorcerer's Apprentice, and I think of like the Disney version.
Yeah.
In like a weird way, it's somewhat similar. And then so again, those are some examples. I won't read the last one just so we can get going here. But that kind of makes sense, right? Like they listen to it, no context of what the title is, and they create a story. They create their own narrative. So I have the video pulled up now, or the piece pulled up, and I'm sharing my screen so we can all see. And I believe Michael and David, you both have the scores out. So let's go ahead and take a listen. Nice, and that's it.
Nice. Should we clap? I'll clap. Yay, let's go.
The difference between Nattiez's experiment and what we're gonna do is instead of not giving you any information, you'll have the information in front of you and kind of try to decipher if it's true to what I intended. And it may work or it may not, but it's again another way to kind of do this experiment of seeing whether narratives can have like uh, a positive effect on what the composer was actually trying to do. I mean, we can kind of talk about it. Is there anything that came up immediately that you felt just that caught your attention in some way?
First thing, at least for me, the first thing that I wanted to ask is, rather than just keeping it like all the percussion instruments, what was kind of like the inspiration for you wanting to have the tape element?
I think, yeah, that's a good question. The tape element for me was more geared towards wanting to break out of a very traditional way of writing, and I felt like doing tape was like the next step. It's what I did with the tape that really coincides with like what the concept was.
Why did you decide on the sounds that you had? Because especially like the arpeggiated sound that kind of
Yeah.
goes through like the entire piece. It kind of sounds more of like an otherworldly, like kind of sci-fi ish kind of sound. So
Huh.
And I
Yeah.
was going for that too. That's literally the
yeah,
first thing I said was like sci-fi.
Okay. That's okay. That's interesting. Like saying otherworldly, although it depending on how you look at it, that term could be very really far or really close from what the piece is trying to convey. So that's interesting that you say that otherworldly. Not melancholy is not the right word. Somber-ish.
yeah. Because I was about to say too, like all the sounds that you picked, at least in terms of like the tape itself, they're like pretty like warm sounds. It's not like really anything I would describe as like being like really shrill or anything. So that's like kind of why I was a little just wondering a little bit of why you picked the sounds that you did.
So now this portion, before we actually talk about some of the elements within the piece and like what the overarching meaning is, we'll go ahead and we'll have you two share your own stories. And again, like it was so literal in the article, so it's like feel free for it to be literal here. Cool. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, Michael. Michael will be going first.
Me. All right. I'm kind of picturing a sci-fi background, like a
Okay.
movie-ish. So a protagonist walks into
Mm-hmm.
a room that is all black. He keeps walking for being able to see what's in front of him, but he just keep on walking and walking. As the
Mm.
walk goes on, several light beams fall into the room. The main character walks toward the light beam, and inside the light beam, several images and visions appear in his mind. And it was his memory that were lost and what he was searching for the whole time.
Wow.
After the vision is over, the light beam is gone, and the room turned back into the dark. The protagonist resumes his walking. As though he found what
That's
he
it.
was looking for. Yeah.
That's this is crazy actually doing the experiment because a lot of that, and we'll have David do his in a second. A lot of that it can be, although it's not like what it is, literally that's like very in the same vein,
Mm.
somewhat. That's insane. That's a crazy like realization. Okay, David.
Sweet. So I was kind of I was kind of in the same vein of like it being kind of like in a I'm not sure if I want to say sci-fi setting, but kind of more in like a post-apocalyptic kind of way.
Okay.
And I kind of broke it up into three sections, which I think kind of correlates with what you did in the score. So like the beginning is kind of more of like if we have like a main character protagonist kind of reflecting back on like what normalcy was, like how civilization used to be,
Okay.
um, kind of reflecting on like their family, what they used to do as like a job, and then later it kind of evolves into the protagonist having to go like scavenge for supplies, which is like near the middle. Um,
Mm.
running into like danger, running into a bunch of people who are like taking advantage of the situation to do like a lot of really bad stuff. And then towards the end, I think it's kind of like the protagonist kind of accepting what his or her reality is at that
Wow.
point. So at least that's the kind of vibe I was getting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, this is awesome. This is awesome because now we're gonna get into what it's about. I'll throw in some like of why I chose this rhythm or like why this, why that. Let me talk about the piece and we'll break it down as we go, and we'll kind of use both of your stories and see if you can tell me like what correlates with what, right? Yeah, so it's about understanding death and trying to figure out and come to terms with what that means. And it wasn't about myself, it's about me eventually having to experience a death with someone. Like that time is close and it's having to come to terms with it and trying to accept that. What can we talk about with your two stories, if either of you want to chime in, that correlates with my whole concept behind the piece and what it's supposed to convey?
Yeah, I think like this images and vision for my story where I kind of mentioned where he kind of have a flashback of what happened. I think that kind of, when we think of death or like, people imagine death, they always say like, oh, you have a flashback, a second of flashback of your entire life. So I guess that was kind of like a connection.
And I think it's interesting how you said I think yours, you started with a dark room, right? And to me, like we'll get into in a second, this first section is, the sounds I use, it's supposed to try to emulate this cloudiness, like in your brain, like you don't understand what, like you can't come to terms with what death really means. And I think that's in the same, along this, I think you can venture to say that's along the same lines of like, yeah, you're in this dark room,
yeah,
and
easily.
you can't see, and does, things aren't really making sense.
I was kind of just thinking like the whole angle of the post-apocalyptic thing.
Yeah,
I feel like
yeah.
that got. I was like, damn, that got kind of close. So I was just thinking about that most of the time. I was like, well, I guess I got the whole death thing kind of close.
Yeah, that and I kind of hinted at that earlier. I know we were talking about, like it gives you, like you were saying, like, oh, it gives me this sci-fi like zombie-ish type of vibe, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, like zombie, like that's like, you can venture to like undead, like you can venture to say that sort of thing. So section 1 is kind of dubbed emotional perplexity. And again, perplexed being like, yeah, you don't quite get it, right? You can't understand what really like lies within the concept of death. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about, and I didn't include everything, but these were some of the examples I was thinking of. So the snare that resonates with the vibraphone hit, right? So I put the snare drum on the vibraphone and it triggers the snares, right? To me, what I was trying to imitate here, and you heard how there was like an Almglocken like sample that rose up and like cut off immediately. So that was me kind of thinking like, yeah, the snare drum with the the wires vibrating kind of sounds very like hazy, and then the Almglocken is kind of this purer tone, like it's trying to clear the mind. Now, the other thing I listed here, introducing the 5-lit rhythm. We often associate odd rhythms with being very uncomfortable, or sevens, or any odd rhythm. So things along those lines. The one thing I didn't include that actually happens throughout the entirety of the piece, and it's notated here very finely. You can probably see it's under the 4/4 or the time signature. It's a low rumble sample, and that was made using a lion's roar. So I used that to create this rumbling sound, or this cloudy like sound, right? So again, this is like the mind being clouded, and it's not like understanding death isn't clear to them.
Yeah, I was actually wanting to say, I noticed that all of like your tape stuff, it's always rising. It never like falls. I feel like that it just introduces a lot of like tension. So like you have the beginning, like say like bar like 29, for example, like you have that beginning of your tape, which starts at the bottom and then it rises up all to the top like 2 bars later. I feel like what you said earlier, you were saying that there's like a lot of like tension and kind of gathering tension because it always like the riser always goes up.
When you first showed me this piece, I was like, man, why did he put so many uncomfortable rhythm? Like, so it kind of it really makes sense now. So awesome.
Cool. The second part, and I think David touched a little bit on this, and the section 2 is called "An Attempt to Discover," and it kind of feels like, weren't you mentioning something along the lines of a journey in some way?
I think I said something like scavenging for like supplies, like having to
Okay.
go out and like try to get supplies and stuff.
It's the person trying to figure it out, like going forth and putting the effort to try and come to terms and understand this idea of death, or this idea of passing.
I think there is more texture that pops up,
Yeah.
and I think that's where the light beams coming in, because the first section where there's very little things like there is certain lawn tone going on, but there's not a whole lot of things. Like it's all like gestury that happen occasionally. But then this section, there's more and more gesture appear and reappear, and that's where I kind of have that image of like, you know, a light beam flow into. There is a direction that you're going. I think that's where I came up with the main character. Oh, there's light beam ahead, and I'm going to walk to her. I think, you know, those introduction of different sound kind of give me that image. I was also going to say one thing. Oh, and then there is a more consistent pulse. So that kind of sort of give me the idea of like, oh, the main character find his purpose, or like find what he's going for. I guess there's more clarity essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So the interlocking triplet, if you notice, we see the tape and the player kind of interlocking these triplets, right? Like they're not played at the same time. You know, it's not quite locked in together in terms of the mind knowing what it means to pass. So that was some of the idea behind that. The overarching phrasing isn't strict, meaning the same idea doesn't start right at the beginning of the bar and end at the end of the bar. That happens less and less. Things become more structured as we go along.
If you had like the same figure 2 bars later, would you say that that bar that's in between them would be like kind of like a call and response kind of thing?
The phrase happens for 3 bars plus like a beat. So that's why it always ends up moving over, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It's that one added beat or some odd beat, whatever I use.
Yeah, so it's not like technically like solidified. It's always changing.
Let's see. Section 3. Let's reference the stories here.
I think for me, this is where the vision ends and the room kind of get back to dark. He figured out what he was looking for, you know, his memory, and then he just keep on walking. And he fulfills his purpose, and he just keep on moving on.
Yeah, and that kind of correlates to what I had with, like, this last part is the last stretch to finally coming to terms with it. And that's especially, I'll talk about it later, that's especially prevalent in the last, like, 8 or so bars that we hear.
You know, this is the part where you kind of accepting, right?
Yeah.
Acceptance is the term. So I guess we both kind of agree on that feeling of, like, you find the answers to the questions, I guess.
Yeah.
I think the ending of mine was that the main character kind of accepts like the new normal, especially in like a post-apocalyptic world. So I think it's kind of does correlate in the whole terms of like accepting that this is what it is now.
Even though there's 3 different interpretations of a similar overarching concept, you can get to like the same overarching broad term conclusion.
It also kind of helps. We have years of training of music, like we listen to you know, larger form of symphonies, and we kind of identify feelings through those, you know. When we, you know, prepare our solo repertoire, we also subconsciously will give, you know, definitions to this each section. So I feel like in a way we're always being trained to see music in a more narrative way, whether you know, you're always thinking or not. You know, if you care enough, you'll actually think about those stuff. And, you know, obviously we all very educated young men.
Exactly.
You know, it's a really cool exercise, but then it's like, it makes sense that a certain thing will line up for us because that's part of our training, essentially.
I was thinking about this too. I think what really helps too, in terms of like to kind of figure out what the narrative is like the sounds that you used for your tape. Because like you use sounds that necessarily aren't like exactly the most, I want to say, like cheery. They're definitely
Yeah.
lower in like the frequency spectrum, so it kind of has more of like a melancholic feel to it.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind
Yeah.
of like how the both of us kind of came up with more of like a
Like
I don't want
doctor,
to say like a downer
Yeah.
kind of thing,
like
but
Yeah.
doctor, depressing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you didn't have those sounds, I think we would have drastically different interpretations of what the narrative would have been.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's very like fulfilling to like use your own work and like see it actually happen like right in front of you, or we kind of like agreed upon like an overarching kind of concept, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. The end, like you notice I turned the snares off. Me playing that last note was like a clearing. The head is clear, like it understands it, it accepts it, it is what it is.
Before we actually start this experience, like, was this what you expect the outcome would be? Like how we
Yeah,
on with certain things?
I was pretty nervous at first. This experiment could go like totally wrong and like we get completely different,
Yeah, like someone
you know.
David will be like, "Oh, this is a love story."
Dude, this is a
Yeah,
freaking
yeah.
like, it's like a
This is a
circus
love
show.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, like we're aligned at
Yeah.
some variations. Like not,
Yeah.
you cannot be a literal exact because we're not the same human being.
Exactly.
We have
Mhm.
different experience, but ultimately, maybe that's the ultimate power of music. To
Yeah.
to be too cliche but like music make human being feel certain ways, and we could all agree with those feelings sometimes.
I just this thought just popped into my mind. But do you think because we're already have enough experience with music, if just musicians that didn't know what the Sorcerer's Apprentice was, because the experiment was done on children who I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have musical experience. But if you were to do it with a group of experienced musicians,
Would they get
stuff-
to the narrative that Dukas was intending?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I ever kind of like thought about that. When I showed the article and we saw like the stories, some were like very like radically off, but some
Yeah.
were like close. I don't know. Like, what do you think?
If a group of experienced musicians were to be in a room and then these people had never heard of the Sorcerer's Apprentice before, during some particular moments throughout the entire piece, they'd be like, the sound, let's say for example, this sounds kind of like a march, or
Mhm.
this sounds like soldiers marching or something, or somewhere along those lines. But I feel like everyone might have like a general idea, like, oh, it sounds like ducks marching together, or it sounds like soldiers
Yeah.
marching together. But it always has like that kind of theme of march.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just like what I was really curious about. I think at least with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, there's just so much happening. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
I would just like would be really curious to see what would happen. Like a pianist was like, all right, you're gonna sit down. The three of you guys are gonna sit down and listen to the Chopin or whatever. At least I don't know about you guys, but I have literally, other than like how good Chopin's music sounds, I have no idea like what it's about.
That's not true.
So
I feel like because if you hear march, you know what a march is. If you hear chorale, you know what a chorale is. Like we know what certain type of music should sound like. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like if we hear a march rhythm, we'll be like, oh, this is a march. Some soldier or ducks is marching. Like you said, at certain points we expose to our enough music repertoire where we can make connection to certain things.
yeah,
Like Chopin's most music are like dance sometimes, certain type of dance.
like waltzes and
yeah,
stuff.
waltz and stuff, and you're like, oh, this is some kind of waltz or dance, and then oh, maybe it's a nod tune. Oh, this is very peaceful and
Yeah, it's just that like I feel like a lot of Chopin's music is like really harmonically complex, and so I wonder if that's where like our differences would come from, depending on like where our ear kind of goes towards. Like,
Yeah.
if would you say it would be more of like, I don't know, I don't want to say jazzy, but if Chopin is using really complex chords, then maybe that's where your ear would kind of go towards, or maybe you would think more on like the classical angle. So
I like to
Yeah.
think we will still have a similar result where like it'll be different narrative, but then
but relatively close together.
we'll align with certain ideas.
Yeah, okay.
But that was
Yeah.
kind of the outcome of this experience. It's like, three different direction, but we could point out a key
The
term
similarity.
a lot.
Yeah.
Like there is like
Yeah.
one word in each section that we could agree on,
Yeah.
Mhm.
acceptance or whatever, discovery, So
Yeah.
I think that maybe not as close as this one, but
I would honestly see like just get and you can maybe even do this like in your class.
Hmm.
Maybe just ask what everyone's opinions were. Like maybe show them the piece first,
Yeah.
especially especially since you're gonna have they're all of course they're all gonna be musicians,
Yeah.
but not all of them are gonna be percussionists, right? So maybe there will be some differences there, at least in terms of like why you chose the instruments that you chose, and maybe
Hmm.
they'll kind of interpret those instruments in a different way.
I don't know. Yeah, I wonder if that barrier would influence their narratives in any way.
Mm.
Inherently, they are different people, so yes, they would. But yeah, that's interesting. The article kind of talks about like relating to the Sorcerer's Apprentice. I believe it talks about like, okay, these children came up with the narratives of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, and they don't, again, they had no context of what the piece was called or anything like that. Because of that, music can't actually create a narrative. Like it can't convey a true narrative because it's not the one that the composer intended.
Like I'll share a personal experience that literally happened
Sure.
to me this semester. I was doing a piece. It's called Six Algaes Dancing, and there is one part where on the fifth movement is a visual movement. Essentially, I'm playing the marimba while doing a lot of dance move. Knowing that I'm not a great dancer, I asked for a dancer for help. And one of the things we talked about is like, how do we interpret and how do we get the audience to interpret what those visual movement means, right? Because like, if I'm just waving my arm, it's not cool. So there has to be a meaning behind those movements. The dancer, one of the thing that dancer said to me that really changed my mind is like, it doesn't matter whether or not the audience know the exact narrative, and you don't necessarily need to put a story or a complete like a movie on each movement, but as long as you have insert certain feelings into the movement, like the audience will see and they will have their own interpretation on those movements because you put certain feelings into it. And that way it's even cooler because like everybody's experience will be different. Like they see things differently. And if anything, I would say that's much better way to think about,
That proves like we stay human.
Yeah.
Like you've heard this like your whole life. Like if everybody was the same, like the world would be so boring.
And like listening music is not a test. Like our experience just then was not a competition between me and David. Where
Yeah.
like who is the closest to Shane's
Yeah.
Shane's interpretation? Like there's no prize. There's no, that was not the point of listening to music. The
Yeah.
point is like music give you certain pleasure and feelings that you need it. And
Yeah.
so I think it's kind of dumb to be like, oh, music cannot convey a certain exact feeling, like,
Yeah. And it's like
okay,
that's fine, and I don't think
yeah.
it needs to. It just can convey something that you take and internalize yourself.
I think that's like part of the reason why sometimes at like at concerts and stuff that plays like emotional like orchestral music, sometimes you might hear of people like crying during those. It's like if we're like watching like a movie or something, maybe it's not necessarily the movie that moved them, but maybe like an experience in their own life that they kind of interpreted with the music, so it really hit them on like a personal level.
Yeah.
So I think the whole thing of like, oh, like music doesn't necessarily have a narrative. I don't know if I personally agree with that, because I think
Yeah.
everyone has their own experiences with that.
Cool.
That was a good note though. I felt like because that actually kind of reminded me, David, what you said was Mahler Symphony. He always put titles in it, but he hate that there is a narrative. It's so funny. He was like,
Oh, really? Oh, I
he's
didn't
like,
know
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. I think he changed his mind. At first, he's like kind of descriptive of his music, but then later on, he kind of become like an absolute music person, where like music is his own
For the
language. It
sake of
doesn't
music.
have meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But then he always put a title in it, and then he regret putting a title in it. But then people was like, "No, this is Titan."
It's like it has to mean something. Like you put this freaking title here.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So it's so funny. Like even the
Oh,
greatest composer could make up their own mind with these issues. I feel like. But anyway, that was just what David said just kind of remind me of that stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, I think we got what we wanted out of this. I think it was like actually it was pretty eye opening for me. You always hear about these experiments in like articles and books, but like doing it yourself, it's like very unique experience, I think. So thanks for being a part of it. You too.
yeah. Thank you for having
Um,
us. That was
yeah,
really
thanks.
fun though. That was cool.
Yeah, and I think it'll help me think about music a little differently, or if it inherently does or not. I think it'll do something like that. Cool. Well, that's all I had. Thanks for being a part of the project. We'll see you all later.